Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this, because today we're looking at a genuinely incredible transformation. For decades, the end of a ship's life cycle meant one thing: a historically dirty, hazardous business. We're talking about toxic runoff leaking directly into oceans, unregulated beaching methods, the kind of stuff that absolutely devastated local environments. But today, we're going to explore how India is fundamentally rewriting that entire narrative. They're taking this highly scrutinized, messy industry and turning it into a tightly regulated, rapidly growing circular economy. It's essentially a natural redemption for end-of-life vessels. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be covering India as a global recycling hub, the coastal states driving this growth, the mechanics inside the circular economy, the new rules and global standards, and finally, navigating the hazardous challenges that still persist.
Section 1. A global recycling hub.
To truly grasp the scope of this revolution, we really have to understand the sheer scale of India's current dominance in the global market. Just look at that staggering fraction: 1/3. India is already an absolute giant in this space, currently processing roughly 1/3 of all global decommissioned ships. They've held on to this massive share largely thanks to historical, geographical advantages, like really high tidal variations that make beaching these massive holes possible, paired with an abundant, highly specialized labor force. And right now, the international spotlight is firmly fixed on them as their domestic policies align to push that number even higher. And this brilliantly illustrates where things are heading next. Look at this swift, massive expansion. While 2024 saw the industry handle between 2.3 and 2.6 million gross tonnage, the projections for 2025 jump drastically, upwards of 4.2 million. You might be wondering, why such a massive spike? Well, this 10% compound annual growth rate through 2028 is heavily driven by a wave of aging, post-pandemic shipping fleets, combined with some incredibly strict new global environmental regulations. Basically, shipping companies are being forced to retire their older, less efficient vessels way earlier than expected. So what does all that extra tonnage actually mean for the economy? By 2030, this sector is projected to generate £3.6 billion in economic value while creating up to 120,000 direct jobs. But the real story here? It's the multiplier effect. By stimulating allied industries, this boom is estimated to support another 700,000 to 800,000 indirect jobs. Think about it. The high-quality steel recovered from these ships is fed directly into local re-rolling mills. That, in turn, supplies critical, lower-cost materials to regional construction and manufacturing sectors. It creates this vast, interconnected economic web. Moving on to Section 2, Coastal States Driving Growth. Now, that massive £3.6 billion expansion isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's being driven by some really intense regional competition. But before we look at the newcomers, we have to acknowledge the reigning king of the hill, Gujarat's Along Sosia Yard. It's currently the world's largest ship recycling hub, but it has this amazing micro-narrative. As the quote mentions, its origins in the 1980s, sparked by a local braveheart, were entirely community-centric. Rather than being launched by massive corporate conglomerates, it literally began as local entrepreneurs, pooling their resources and labor. Today, that grassroots foundation supports around 200,000 livelihoods, having historically recycled 8,500 ships and recovered an astonishing 62 million tons of steel. Now, what's really interesting about this is how other states are aggressively mobilizing to capture their share of the booming market. Look at Maharashtra up at the top, targeting a massive £5.2 billion investment by 2030, utilizing their huge coastline to build green recycling hubs with heavy 15% capital subsidies. Andhra Pradesh is integrating recycling into a broader £2 billion maritime cluster, but pay close attention to the specific strategies here. Odisha is pouring £316 million into a hub near Paradip Port precisely because it's close to massive regional steel plants that are desperate for scrap metal. Meanwhile, down in Kerala, they're taking a highly specialized niche focus, breaking down smaller vessels at Cochin to adapt to local draft limits and regional market demands. Oh, and we absolutely can't ignore Tamil Nadu. They are leveraging their strong engineering base at sites like Tuticorin and Valinakam. But their real strategic differentiator, international collaboration. They are actively seeking partnerships with countries like Japan and South Korea to facilitate direct tech transfers. We're talking about bringing in advanced green technologies, like the engineering required to build impermeable dry docks instead of using traditional tidal beaching, and installing advanced effluent treatment plants to completely eliminate oceanic runoff. Which brings us to Section 3, Inside the Circular Economy. We've talked a lot about the economics, but let's shift to the actual mechanics of breaking down these massive vessels. So, the crucial point is what happens on the ground. When you think of scrapping a ship, you might picture chaotic heaps of toxic waste. But modern yards function through systematic, meticulous stripping. Before the hull is even touched, teams drain all the hazardous fluids and fuels. Then, they carefully remove reusable machinery, electronics, cables, you name it. Finally, they cut the pure steel hull apart, plate by plate. Because of this exacting process, a staggering 97% of a ship's materials are actually recovered, with 75 to 85% of that being pure steel. Turning a decommissioned liability into vital raw material drastically reduces India's reliance on imported scrap. Let's stack up exactly what those environmental savings look like in the real world. By 2030, this high-yield recycling process is going to conserve 16 million tons of iron ore and 9 million tons of coal every single year. But honestly, perhaps the most prestigious environmental win here is the carbon offset. Think about it. Mining virgin iron ore and running coal-fired smelting plants is incredibly energy-intensive. By skipping that entirely and melting down recovered ship steel instead, recycling just 1 ton saves 1.6 tons of CO2. Scaled up across the industry, that avoids 19 to 20 million tons of carbon emissions annually. You can really see how this totally changes the dynamic of the industry. Historically, shipbreaking was plagued by toxic leakages. It was a mess. Today, compliant facilities are actively preserving coastal ecosystems. They're doing this by utilizing impermeable concrete cutting floors and deploying floating containment booms that catch any accidental oil spillages before they can drift into fragile mangroves or local fisheries. This hands-on environmental protection directly aligns the whole industry with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 8 for decent work, 9 for industry, 12 for responsible consumption, and 14 for life below water. That perfectly sets up our next segment, new rules and global standards. This massive transition from a highly toxic history to a globally compliant circular economy is strictly underpinned by an overlapping web of laws. Tracing the chronology here, we see India proactively tightening the net over time. The 2013 Indian Ship Recycling Code and the subsequent 2019 Recycling of Ships Act fundamentally changed yard operations. They moved away from informal labor practices by mandating strict hazardous material inventories before a ship could even be touched, and legally required mandatory protective gear and safety training for all workers. And now, everything is accelerating toward June 26, 2025. So what is that critical 2025 date all about? That is when the Hong Kong Convention, or HKC, officially goes into effect. This is the ultimate international treaty setting the global benchmark for safe, environmentally sound ship recycling. To be HKC compliant, yards must possess ship-specific recycling plans, meaning every single vessel has a custom blueprint for safe dismantling, and they must submit to regular, rigorous international audits. Remarkably, in Gujarat alone, 112 out of 131 yards are already compliant with these upcoming global standards. Of course, to ensure facilities actually make these expensive HKC upgrades, the government is aggressively sweetening the deal using precise financial mechanics. For instance, a 40% scrap value credit note acts as a massive financial discount on future scrap purchases for yard owners who commit to green infrastructure. On top of that, zero-duty imports slash the upfront costs of bringing in modern, high-tech heavy cranes and cutting gear from overseas. By significantly boosting profit margins, these incentives ensure that upgrading to green standards isn't just a legal chore, it's a highly profitable business move. Let's move to our final section and see how this builds, navigating the hazardous challenges. Look, despite all the economic promise and regulatory prestige, we really have to look at the frank, unforgiving realities that still persist on the ground. First off, these ships are loaded with lethal materials. Inhaling asbestos fibers causes severe respiratory failure, and heavy metals like lead can permanently contaminate local groundwater if handled improperly. Second, the dismantling process remains incredibly labor-intensive, requiring constant, vigilant safety training and gear. And third, expanding this capacity in eastern states requires immense capital. Unlike Gujarat's established tidal flats, regions in the east often have to build expensive, deep-water, impermeable dry docks from absolute scratch just to be able to compete. Because at the end of the day, having excellent laws on the books simply isn't enough. The source material emphasizes that strict, continuous enforcement of the 2019 Recycling of Ships Act is absolutely critical to protect lives.
Continuous enforcement means unannounced surprise government inspections, strict independent auditing of a yard's waste disposal logs, and severe penalties for noncompliance. Overcoming these specific dangers through uncompromising accountability is literally the only way India will prevent an unforgiving environmental whiplash and actually sustain its leadership role at this turning point.
Which brings us to this crucial question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. The industry is unequivocally at a turning point. We see the robust policies, the evolving infrastructure, and the massive opportunities for job creation and environmental resource recovery. But can India successfully balance this incredible £3.6 billion economic expansion with the unyielding, stringent safety needs of its human workforce and its fragile coastal ecosystems? It is a high-stakes balancing act of a true recycling revolution, and for sure, the world is watching very closely to see how they pull it off. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive, and as always, keep asking the big questions.